Okay, I think we'll start. Welcome to this very first event of what we are calling a new series of discussions, presentations, workshops, hopefully, of critical humanities. This will be a series which will not only focus on some of the crises that we have faced in the humanities disciplines, but also new sorts of work, the cutting edge, more fascinating kind of work which is coming out of new research and different institutional locations. So in our first event, we have 4 young and very exciting voices, not 4, actually 3, very exciting voices from Indian academia, particularly on literary studies. The title for today's event is Archives and Afterlives, Literary Studies Now. We have speakers who work with very diverse and very different kind of archives, ranging from 19th century British periodicals to popular Hindi literature, and digital material. So what we'll do, we'll first have these 3 presentations, brief presentations. They'll speak for about 15 minutes each. Then we'll open it up for further discussions. So our first speaker today is Teja Verma Pusapati. Teja is an assistant professor of English at Shiv Nadar University, India. Her book, Model Women of the Press, will be out very soon, I understand, from Routledge. Her articles on Victorian women's foreign correspondence, feminist journalism, and celebrity culture have appeared in different journals like Victorian Periodicals Review, Women's Writing, and 19th Century Gender Studies. Her new project on Victorian imperial periodicals has been awarded a Curran Fellowship by the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. The title for Teja's talk today is Researching Periodicals in Their Own Right, Text and Context. So it's over to you, Teja.
I just wanted to start by thanking CSDS and Baidik Bhattacharya for this opportunity to have this conversation about periodicals and archives. My presentation has 3 broad sections. I will start by charting a brief history of how and why Victorian periodicals came to be studied. Second, where I will track some of the methodological shifts that have taken place in this field, and end with an example from my own work on a 19th century women's, in fact, a feminist journal. Throughout, I will use the term periodicals broadly to refer to texts that were produced at regular intervals of time. So I will include the daily newspaper, weekly, monthlies, and so on. There are some debates about the distinctions between newspapers and periodicals, and I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A or the discussion after the session. So I'll begin. It is now widely recognized amongst Victorianists, at least, that the unprecedented proliferation of periodicals in the 1800s in England had far-reaching social and cultural implications. An estimated 125,000 titles were published in the Victorian period, catering for all sections of society. They ranged from highbrow to sensation journals, from missionary to military journals, women's magazines, children's journals, and so on. And each copy usually reached several readers. So in reach and impact, periodicals far outstripped books. And in fact, many of the novels that we now read in book form were initially serialized in periodicals. For example, Charles Dickens's Hard Times initially came out in a weekly that Dickens edited called Household Words. Now, despite this historical importance, periodicals had for quite a long time actually remained quite relatively underutilized. And one of the reasons for this has been what scholars have called the overabundance of the archive. And this sense sort of comes through very clearly if one looks at the very first issue of the Victorian Periodicals newsletter. So I'll just share that. Sorry, is it visible? Sorry, there you go. Yes. This starts off, and it's an interesting editorial because the founding editorial actually starts off with a copy, with a quotation from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland about the walrus and carpenter who are walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see quantities of sand. And it's very interesting because the term quantities of sand is here, of course, being used to potentially unmanageable archive. And since that early issue of the VPN, a number of groundbreaking bibliographical and editorial projects have helped gain a better understanding of this domain of text. This includes Walter Houghton. I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the footnote in the editorial, he's actually the carpenter in the above quote, who went on to oversee the monumental Wellesley Index to Victorian periodicals, which is still being amended in the current index. And then there was, of course, the John Norton's Waterloo Directory, and more recently, Laurel Brake and Marissa de Moore's Dictionary of 19th Century Journalism. And there have also been studies that are directed at specific areas. For example, Paddy Shuttleworth's work on science in the Victorian periodicals, which resulted in both a number of editorial volumes of scholarship, but also in freely accessible indexes. And there is something very interesting about the kind of indexes that are produced by scholars versus commercial indexes, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. And really what most of these scholars, in one way or the other, talk about in many of these is really they're arguing against a kind of scholarship that amounted to what Laurel Brake and others call at one point conducting raids on the press, about Mark Turner in a wonderful phrase that evokes both the haste and the disruptiveness of that method, calls the smash and grab approach, which is really, they're describing this method of going to a title, pulling out a specific contribution and using it without any discussion about its periodical context. And what they call for instead is to study the periodical press in its own terms, to approach this archive not as a source, but as a subject of study. Now, this includes foremost attending very closely to the quote-unquote periodical context, paying attention to qualities such as the specific seriality, the material quality, paper, typography, price, site of production and distribution, the full range of contributors, editors, publishers, printers, and so on, but also how it related to other titles in the field. So that's one set of questions that are brought into the study of periodicals. The other is really to look more closely at periodical form. So unlike books, as Margaret Beetham says, periodicals are Janus-like in that they look both forwards to the next issue and backwards to the previous issue. They are both open-ended and open-ended because they visit closure, they come over time, they are miscellaneous, they can be read in any order, and end-stopped because each issue is nevertheless distinct from the previous one. And while it is part of this larger framework, it still has to be readable. Each number has to be readable. It has to stop and start in a way such that it makes some sense in itself. And there have also been questions about the form as a larger framework, a mediating framework. This is James Mussel, who talks about how it's really interesting that there are some features that get repeated issue after issue in any journal, which really functions like a formal mediating framework, such that news, for example, which may be very recent, very abundant, but it cannot just be announced. Breaking news, so to speak, has to fit into existing, familiar, older formats within the newspaper. And there have also been questions of the genre of the periodical, weekly, monthly, specialist, general, etc., and genre in the periodical. Periodicals are usually miscellanies that bring together a wide range of genres. So you could have, for example, fiction, poetry, review, news, all of which sit alongside each other in very close juxtaposition. Now, what really happens to one's definition of literature when one begins to attend to these things is it's really that the first, and this really came out of course, earlier shifts in literary studies such as new historicism, where one began to look very closely, these scholars, to how literature was connected to other discourses alongside which it appeared, so history, politics, etc. Now, of course, no sound reading of literature really can be historical in the current moment. But what these scholars were able to do really was to show, to attend in some sense to, in very fine terms, to formal changes and formal interchanges between these genres. So for example, Anne Humphrey's work looks at how even political news that came out in Raymond's Miscellany would follow the conventions of melodrama that were actually printed in other sections in this journal. And it also enables, I think, like what one can call the double life of literature in book and serial form, where many of these genres, even in the 19th century, had an independent life of their own. So I mentioned earlier the instance of the novel, but that's also true actually for some of the very influential essays that we tend to think of as, representative, yet non-contextualized very often. For example, Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy first actually came out of, was initially serialized in the Cornhill magazine as a series of essays in the Cornhill magazine. And in this double life, I think there are questions here of how, questions which are in, for example, of the move from something being rescued from ephemerality to give it the status of a stable text, and to give it a more stable form. And there are, I, for example, look at questions of, because I work more closely with authorship, questions of copyright, because actually copyright is far more unstable in the periodicals than it was in book form. So it really determined what was being privileged and for what reasons. Thirdly, I think specifically for those working in periodicals, it also meant that you began to move away from looking at periodicals as nurseries for books, as some kind of unformed domain which is on its way to becoming a book, and to really look at the kind of, to look at it on its own terms also means to look very closely at what are the pressures that a periodical will bring to what is sayable and what is not sayable. And in the domain of authorship, for example, there has been a shift away from looking at the journalist as some kind of trainee to the writer. This, for example, was very dominant in scholarship on George Eliot, where her periodical writings would be seen as some kind of early working out of the kind of ideas that she would develop later in her books and novels. And Fionnuala Dillon's work really shows that they were actually far more closely interrelated. So now biographical approaches to authorship, of course, have long been challenged in the work of Barthes and Foucault and so on. But in the domain of periodicals, what really happens is, one, that the author, of course, we let go of the figure of the author as some kind of originating genius, but also very clearly working as a collaborator with an editor, proprietor, printer, distributor, so on. That's one. But also in a more general sense, really emerges as a far more fractured figure who in the constantly evolving and diverse field of the periodicals speaks in very differing and sometimes opposing voices across different publications. There's one writer that I work on, there's been work, it's called Eliza Lynn Linton, and she's really upheld as one of the most famous arch anti-feminists in the 19th century. And whereas if you actually look at her early work in the radical journals, she's writing articles in praise of Mary Wollstonecraft, who's actually very difficult to mention, not least champion in the early 19th century. And then really, I just wanted to sort of to bring all of this to a close and in looking at with an instance from my own work. So I was looking at, so I study really how women journalists who were writing politics in a broad sense were also actually creating models of professional authorship in the 19th century, where the very figure of the professional author first came to be forged. And I was looking at the representative journal of the Victorian women's movement, which is the English Women's Journal, which came out from 1858 to 1864. Now, it was primarily aimed at expanding paid work for single women, but interpreted this issue very broadly. And so it ran a very wide range of campaigns, from rescuing needle women to female immigration, to women's entry into medicine, to reforming marriage laws and property laws, and so on and so forth. Now, there has been very significant scholarship on the history of feminism, for example, which has noted the importance of this journal And they did have a very significant impact. The journalists who ran it also went on, some of whom actually went on to found Girton College in Cambridge, which was one of the first higher education institutions for women in England. But really, I want to move away from the content, important as that is. What is really interesting is the form that they choose to bring this out in. Now, they could have chosen to go with the pamphlet form or even with the single topic periodical form, which were all very much available in the mid-19th century at the time at which they brought this out. But actually, what is particularly interesting is that if one actually looks at, so this is the journal in volume form, and I'll just come to this in a minute. This is how the first March issue looked like. What is interesting is that it is very much cued into presenting itself as a general magazine, reformist, but general in terms of its form. So for example, it brings together all the characteristic elements of women's magazines, general articles, fiction, poetry, biography, reviews, advice columns, readers' letters, but casts them all in light of its call for reform. In the first issue, for example, there's a wonderful review of Coventry Patmore's Angel in the House. And for those of you who know this poem, it's one of the most representative poems of Victorian domestic. It's an ode to Victorian domesticity. But it talks about how the angel is actually so angelic that she's not calling out her husband who's beating her up, and then turns that into a call for reform of marriage laws. So it's a certain way in which the form of the review, which has a much longer history in both the general magazine and in Victorian publications, is turned and made serviceable for a particular cause. And Patmore's resoundingly popular Ode to Conventional Wifehood is used to fuel readerly support for further reforms of marriage laws. And also, so what does this do when one begins to look at the form, when one begins to hear the various kinds of voices? So there's the voice of, for example, the investigative journalist, which comes and news snippets. There's that of the poet who comes about in, the poetry sections, and there's this very wide range of voices in which they speak. It undoes this sort of underlying assumption in a lot of scholarship that feminist writing in the Victorian England was really the sort of repetitive, single-toned, monotonous writing. What it also actually, for me, was particularly interesting is that it alerts us to thinking of how readerships were actually pre-configured as markets. So there is no way, and the reason they were adopting this general form was to actually have a far wider reach in the market amongst people who may be reform-minded or willing to listen to ideas of reform, but were not really full signed up members of the cause, as it were. And one of the things that also involves, so I just thought and to think of the feminists as not as, just going and having their say, but really having to work with markets, with commerce, with the larger structures of the press. And I thought I'd really end by sort of going back to one of the things that this idea of this vast expanse and how one begins to narrow in and investigate. And one of the ways in which, like when I was looking at the journal, it is a manageable sort of 6 years, and one can read it if one puts one's mind to. But at the same time, it also means working constantly with a sense of lag, of a vast sense of text, which actually is now lost, because as you can see, I was using, and most scholars can only use, because that's the only form in which it's available, the volume form. Whereas it didn't come out like this, it came out in monthly issues, but they haven't survived. This is partly because what survives to us is a result of all kinds of decisions. Could be very well informed, could also be, some arbitrary decision of a librarian. There's and so on. What have also been stripped off in this particular issue that one has access to is advertisements. So, that sense of the market, which is indicated in the form, would have been far stronger if one had the advertisements that did come out with this. And there was some sense of, because there's some reviews which mention this, but really there was no, it was hard to find this text. And in a very wonderful moment of discovery in the physical archive, I found one ad in the Harvard Schlesinger Library's archives of medical history, because as I said, they were also running a campaign for medical women. And that had one scrap of text, but it had a full multi-page advertiser. Now, what is interesting there is that in some sense, that is this old-fashioned sort of find in the archive. But while on the one hand, it sort of definitely allows one to get a better sense of the kind of market that they were aiming for, that, it also indicates very sharply the kind of gaps that one is constantly working with, and that the sense of wholeness is actually highly illusory, even as one has the full run of the journal available in one form. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Teja. That was fantastic. I'm sure we'll have many questions and we'll come back to you in a moment. Let's go to our next presentation. Our next speaker is Akriti Manwani. Akriti teaches literature at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University. Her research interests include book and magazine history, popular literature, Hindi literature and literary history, and the history of libraries in South Asia. Her work has been published in Modern Asian Studies and South Asia, and she is also the co-author of a very interesting book. It's called Indian Genre Fiction, Pasts and Future Histories, which was published by Routledge in 2019. Akriti's talk today is titled The Magazine and the Archive. So Akriti, over to you.
Thanks so much. I'll be reading from the laptop, so I won't be able to see any reactions. So, just before we begin, please feel free to interrupt me if you can't hear me or if I suddenly cut off. So, thanks very much to Baidik and CSDS for inviting me here. And I'm also very happy to be part of this with two of my colleagues with whom I've been having a very exciting set of conversations for a few years now, where we've seen projects old and new develop. And I'm very happy that I'm following, Teja's presentation, because, I have some advertisements and I'm going to be talking about them. For today's conversations, where we've been asked to reflect on literary archives that we work with, I've chosen to revisit research that I've spent the most time with. That is the 1950s and 60s popular publications, particularly Hindi middlebrow magazines and paperbacks. In the interest of time, I will quickly go through several and hopefully related points about why and how I use these archives. I'll limit my examples from two very well-known magazines, Dharmyog, a weekly magazine published by Bennett Coleman Company from Bombay, and Sarita, a monthly magazine published by Delhi Press from Delhi. These are not high literary magazines, and they're not devoted exclusively to the short story, but feature a variety of articles, including fiction, non-fiction, advice columns, readers' letters, editorials, cartoons, expositions on new literature, and so on. Now, I really entered my archives armed with one specific question. What can we know about the making of post-independence middle-class selves through consumption? The 1950s and 60s are a remarkably elusive period of time that have been predominantly examined and narrated in terms of institutional restructuring, such as state building, drafting the constitution, legislative and economic planning. In the last few decades, this period has also been investigated through other important interventions, such as partition trauma, consolidation of ideas of citizenship, and so on. However, this making of middle-class selves through consumption seems to have largely fallen through the cracks due to these larger themes of state planning or nation state making. So my first point of interest was trying to find a story of middle-class consumption habits, of objects within the magazine, of the magazine itself, of the imagination of oneself. However, whatever the point of interest may be, why is examining this rather cumbersome archive important? And I looked to Teja because she was talking about how she was giving the example of the 6 years of going through material. In my case, it was about at least 15 years of looking through weeklies and monthlies. It is very cumbersome indeed, but it is rewarding because of its sheer reach and size. Dharmyug, for example, was the largest selling Hindi magazine of the 1560s. We're talking something like 60,000 subscription figures in 1958 to more than 110,000 subscribers in mid-1960s. So it is these humongous, bulky archives that give us novel insights to social and cultural histories that one presumes have already been interrogated and recast. So I found that while the immediate post-independence period had been studied largely from the perspective of the 3 Ps, right? Planning, policy, and the partition, it was also a period when middle-class selves were being reimagined and re-articulated in differentiated and layered ways. When I took it as my focus, the form and content of a range of best-selling magazines, paperbacks in Hindi, I found that it constructed a new story for the 1950s. One that is marked by middle-class consumption beyond either the perspective of austerity or a deferral of pleasure. Now, the middle classes are the same social constituencies that have been considered in many senses to be fundamental to the wider dispersion of the Nehruvian vision. My archives, though, argued a different story with me, that the middle classes who read these publications were everyday consumers who were carving their roads outside this logic of the austere nation. I also found how almost immediately after 1947, the pre-independence rhetoric of nationalism, selective service, and duty to an ideal beyond the family and the individual, reflected in the period's popular nationalist journals, could no longer really serve as a template in order to rationalize, control, or regulate gender roles, relationships, and consumer behavior in the post-independence period. So for me, I really first looked at my literary archives to get a stronger sense of culture and social history. One primary idea that I've just started working with over the past couple of months, actually, and so it's in very, very unformed stages, really, is the newly independent nation's relationship to food. Very exciting and recent work by Benjamin Siegel and others has brought to light the failure of the first Indian government's planning for food sufficiency. Taylor Sherman's essay, and I'm going to be reading out the entire title of the essay, From Grow More Food to Miss a Meal. These are 2 campaigns: Hunger, Development, and the Limits of Post-Colonial Nationalism in India, 1947 to 57, with its devastatingly self-explanatory title, is another example of how the path to food and economic independence was, and I'm quoting her, fraught, contested, and sometimes chaotic, end of quote. However, what do we make of the relentless emphasis on food in the magazines I work with? While food history of the 1950s has been examined from the point of view of planning and political campaigns urging citizens to give up diet staples in the light of austerity, the archive of these magazines examines the problem from an alternative viewpoint, that of plenty. Now, this study on food products and diet is also directly in relation to the control and regulation of essential commodities in the form of the Essential Commodities Act 1955. Again, while a substantial body of work exists specifically on the Essential Commodities Act 1955 and commodity control before this act in general, popular magazines encourage specific diets and food consumption patterns. If, as legal historian Rohit argues, and I'm going to quote him, the state sought to tame the market and consciously shape new standards of ethical behavior for the citizen consumer through law, end of quote, how are these essential commodities framed through ad campaigns and often ignored recipe columns? However, and that is a third logic of the work here, and this is again the point that Teja has brought up. All of this knowledge had to be contextualized firmly against what has turned out to be a very complex publishing and print market, which is to say that we need to comprehensively reconcile studies of reading and consumption in the period under consideration. So the magazines here aren't a data mining enterprise. They have to be studied in their own right. Therefore, if I return to the food example for the moment, editorials, recipe columns, campaigns, advertisements, either pushing for culinary creativity or nationalist austerity, have to be contextualized according to the specific magazine in question, and therefore its presumed readership. In other words, while the set of magazines I examined turned away from these narratives of scarcity to embrace this sort of surfeit of plentiful images of nourishing and delicious food, and these are the words that appear again and again, I had to make sense of how certain advertisements appeared in some magazines and not at all, or an altered copy in some others. This actually makes the question of market segmentation and stratification even clearer. This, in addition to price points of the magazines, paper quality, editorials, contributed again to the larger research question that I started off with. Also, if the first question was how middle class selves were imagined and imagined themselves, the second question really was to then understand these distinctions between highbrow, lowbrow, and what I found through my research, middlebrow publications. Now, this brings us to the second part of the paper, which is the other aspect of working with literary archives from the perspective of literary studies. Now, if you move away from the question of social or cultural histories for the moment and focus specifically on literary history itself, these magazines also provide us with fresh and much needed insights. Let's take here the example of writers' ongoing relationships with writing as profession in the 1950s. Ravikanji has written an excellent essay on the Delhi coffee house culture and pointed me to this collection of essays called Delhi Tea House, edited by Baldev Vanshi, where several Hindi writers reminisce about writing for Dharmyog, which was actually based in Bombay. In an eclectic crisscrossing of cities in the writers' and editors' minds, the cities of Delhi and Bombay are bridged by the way of being published in magazines, and more particularly in a very commercially successful and acclaimed magazine. At the same time, some magazines populated by short stories from the same writers do not find mention at all. That is where examining magazines themselves becomes even more revealing. So, for example, in the 1950s, Sarita publishes works by Mohan Rakesh, Yashpal, Rajendra Yadav, the whole group, as it were. For this time period in Hindi specifically, we know about the power of memoirs, of recollections, of which contemporary Hindi writers, critics, academics do publish a lot of. But what about things that go uncollected, unremembered? A literary history needs to access these debates as well. Another very significant question that arises, of course, is one of the politics of language. The periodical nature of these popular magazines is an excellent ground to consider the all-important question of the history of Hindi itself. While the institutionalization of Hindi and the implications of the colonial Hindi-Urdu or the post-colonial Hindi-English divide is often focused on, and in fact, I do it myself for another project on the Hindi Sahitya Sammelan, a leading Hindi literary association. It's fascinating to see how Hindi also functioned as a non-institutional voice in these magazines and paperbacks. I have several examples of this, but I'll just give you a couple very briefly here from Sarita's editor, publisher Vishwanath. In an editorial in the March 1958 issue, Vishwanath very provocatively began, and I'll quote him, Hindi, or should we call it Hindustani, because it includes both Hindi and Urdu, end of quote. Vishwanath also periodically engages with typographic battles, which also become super interesting. For example, Vishwanath also strongly advocated to keep the nukta in Sarita, as well as fought with the reader when the reader suggested that they stop using what they termed an English full stop and start using the Hindi poon viram instead. I take my cues from work already established in the field of book, magazine, literary history and debates in both Hindi and English language scholarship, which has already examined periodicals as occupying a significant space in late colonial Hindi public sphere. For my own case, I found that if we look at popular and commercially successful magazines in the post-1947 period, we find more specificity to the ideologically driven work of Hindi and how it was not just a function of debates between the primary actors and the intellectuals in the public sphere or in the parliament, or even prescriptions of nationalist journals. Finally, in the case of my material, I found that a multilingual history of language and literary cultures also needs to be tied to specific, sort of publishing endeavors. For example, it would be instructive to read the Hindi archive in relation to the parallel Urdu and English ones of the sister publications of the same publishers, such as Caravan and the Urdu Sarita in the case of Sarita in Delhi Press, and the Illustrated Weekly of India, or maybe Sarika for Dhanvyog. What would we learn about the mutual relationships and entanglements between Hindi, Urdu, and English print culture in this crucial post-independence period, who may actually not be heading in entirely different directions and imaginations? I mean, it can mean something as simple as finding the same writers, consecrated or not, somebody like Mohan Rakesh, who we all know about, or somebody like Vimla Luthra, whom we probably have not heard of, in Hindi, Urdu, and English issues around the same time period. It could also be something like the stratification of advertisements that I talked about earlier. So I think I'll start wrapping up here. I've tried to focus on one literary archive today that is extremely popular Hindi magazines of the 50s and 60s to make a case for them, especially in the decades following 1947. I realized that while several remarkable and groundbreaking works have emerged for the pre-1947 period using this archive, we are only scratching the surface with respect to the power of these magazines. For instance, a new vibrant body of work is emerging on world literature and Cold War politics of Indian writers and in little magazines in English and in other languages. This new body of material is already making me revisit some of my own guesses about why, for example, Dhanvyog produced so much content on and from America. Is it merely the case of budding cosmopolitanism derived from financial strengths of the publishing house that could fund such visits to America? Or is it another example of ideological fault lines that have been created? Or is it a mixture of both? I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akriti. Thanks a lot. It's a very different archive, but there are very crucial overlaps with what Teja also discussed. So we'll go to our third and final speaker, that is Vinayak Das Gupta. Vinayak is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Shiv Nadar University. His research focuses on the analysis of historical photographs using visual theory and computational methods. He is also interested in photographic cultures in South Asia, digital curation, and digital preservation. The title for Vinayak's talk today is The Life of the Archival Object. So over to you, Vinayak.
Thanks, Baidik. Thanks for the introduction, and I'd like to.
You muted yourself, Vinayak. Unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So I was going to thank Baidik for the introduction and also for inviting me and my colleagues to this series. I'd also like to thank the CSDS for extending this invitation. What I'd like to do is, I'm also, like Akriti, going to read off my computer. So if, for instance, I suddenly manage to mute myself again, please let me know, and I'll do the needful. So in the interest of time, I'll just get to it straight away. This presentation considers the questions of the afterlife, that is the Nachleben, as we would find in German liberal thought, and the survival or the Überleben of objects in the digital archive. Now, I primarily work with digital archives, so I'm going to ground all these discussions in the digital archive. Now, I've had the fortune to work on some pioneering projects, digital repositories for cultural artifacts, such as Bichitra. This is a project from the School of Cultural Texts and Records in Jadavpur University. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And for instance, the Letters of 1916, a very large public humanities project out of Trinity College, Dublin. So my experience of working on these projects have shaped my thoughts on the topic at hand, this question of the life of the archival object. I've also had the fortune to work with institutions such as the Digital Repository of Ireland, DRI, on methods for determining best practices for digital preservation and the survival of digital objects in the electronic space. So unlike my colleagues, I would approach this presentation not as the user of the archive, but rather as the creator of the archive. I would like to anchor my thoughts today on digital preservation to Bichitra. I started working on this project in 2011, so a long time ago, almost a decade now. This ambitious project, sponsored by the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, is a full repository of virtually all manuscripts and bibliographically important print editions of the complete writings of Tagore in Bengali and English. It contains images of all the primary materials. So we are talking about 50,000 pages of manuscript and another 90,000 pages of print, transcripts for all the material. So electronic texts that have been produced from these images, indicating all scribal features of the manuscripts, a comprehensive bibliography, a timeline, separately for book and journal publications, a search engine, and a collation program. And this is what Bichitra really is. It's a collation program called Probhed, which compares variant text of a work at 3 levels. There is the first level, which is the chapter, the scene, or the canto. The second level, which is the paragraph, the speech, or the stanza. And the third level, which is the word. So as you can imagine, putting together such a project is a lot of work, a lot of hard work from a lot of different people. So it is reasonable to expect that this archive survives the ravages of time. But how does one plan for this? How do we find a rational, logical, and cohesive method through which a possible continuity may be imagined? We are aware of the pressures exerted by emergent technologies as they render the past obsolete. We may be reminded of Walter Benjamin's New Angel as it weeps, witnessing the dust heap of history. The storm we call progress drives us into a future, leaving behind the debris of the past. In this apocalyptic landscape, the digital archive stands figuratively as that which connects the past to the future. The survival of the archive depends on 3 conditions: physical existence, access, and use. Physical existence of the archive depends on capital, the upkeep of servers and electronic storage devices. Now we are aware of this, and if you have experience of working in archival projects, you will know that getting grants, trying to keep a project alive, it is a significant challenge, and keeping a project running, so paying for the servers, paying for electronic storage devices, it is very, very expensive. So that we have to keep in mind, the physical existence of the archive. And by archive, I mean a digital archive. However, a discussion on this is perhaps beyond the scope of this presentation today, but I'd happily engage with any questions that you might have about this. So I move on to the second idea, which is access. Access refers to how the digital objects may be cognized and retrieved from the repository. Much like the physical archive, the digital archive wraps each object in a number of markers that allow the user to search for them and to retrieve them from the archive. So if you went to a physical archive, you look at a catalog, there'll be a record for the object, so on and so forth. It's very much the same for a digital archive. There is also a record. So when you type in whatever it is, the title, the name of the author, the date, various means through which you can search for it, right? You can search for it because the curator has assigned these markers to the object. And this is a vital step because it ensures the survival of the object. If one is unable to retrieve an object from the repository, if one has no access to the object in that sense, the object will be lost. And whether then you spent effort digitizing it or not will not make any sense. Of course, there are standardized processes through which these markers, also referred to as metadata, are attributed. There's considerable literature on how these markers are conceived and the methods through which they are attributed. Again, I'm happy to discuss these later if you'd like to talk about this. The part that is often overlooked is actually the use of archival objects. And I'm also taking from what Teja and Akriti were talking about, that, for instance, Teja talked about the missing advertisements, something that would have added to her project, but something that was missing in the archive that she was considering. So this idea of use of archival objects is what I'd like to spend some time on today. If the objects in an archive are used, they ensure, for instance, funding and thus the upkeep of physical architecture. So if an archive is widely used, then one finds the means to generate the grants necessary for their upkeep. And we can also say that level and nature of access determines use. So if something is well described, is easily accessible, then it also encourages use. If an object is cognizable, it has greater chance of being used. However, how does one determine the use? How will these objects be used in the future? So for instance, when Teja talked about the missing advertisements, whoever had put together this corpus did not think the advertisements to be important. So what we are talking about is how can one articulate the desire of the future user? To summarize, one cannot. However, there may be methods to prolong the life of these objects and the archive. Here I'd like to introduce two ideas, modularity and virtuality. Now, these are ideas that are from a project I'm working on at this time. So this is a great opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts with you. I would like to think of Vichitra, this very oral edition of Tagore's works, and perhaps all similar digital archives, as a modular technical system. This idea of modularity is borrowed from Gilbert Simondon's conceptualization of a technical mentality. Simondon proposes that technical mentality offers a mode of knowledge and is visible on the, and I quote, discovery of common modes of functioning, or of a regime of operation in otherwise different orders of reality, end quote. This doctrine of analogy, and technical mentality is this doctrine of analogy that he's proposing. This doctrine of analogy proposes certain postulates. The first, and for us the most important of these, considers the technical object to comprise subsets that are relatively detachable from the whole of which they are a part. The technical object is conceived as that which requires control, repair, and maintenance through testing or modification, or if necessary, a complete change of one or several of its subsets that compose it. In other words, the technical object is modular and can be continuously improved or repaired by the modification of individual parts of the object. I tend to think of digital archives as technical systems because that is perhaps the most rational or logical way in which one can conceive of a software system. Vichitra by design is also a modular system. While there is an identifiable cohesive whole, So this is a variorum edition of the Ghost works. It can also be observed as a sum of its parts, the images, the transcribed electronic texts, the bibliography, the timeline, the search engine, the collation software. These are all parts of a larger whole, but all existing individually. Also, these can also be broken down into further parts, but I won't get into that right now. Modularity ensures that the system can be continually refined if, for instance, a new manuscript comes into existence, for instance. It can be added to the corpus without having to rebuild the whole system. Now, this is one of the great advantages of a digital system, that it can be modified. Modularity resists obsolescence, the primary threat to survival of any technical system. Right? All technical systems tend to be rendered obsolete. We live in this use and throw, made to break society. But archives cannot be that. And digital archives need to resist this obsolescence. So this modularity is what resists obsolescence. But modularity also has a second purpose. A modular system is best placed to answer the questions posed by the future user. The future user of Vichitra might not be interested in collation or the variants that is produced in different editions of a single text or of a single work. She might be interested in the transcribed text for some other purpose, or she might be interested in the scribal features of manuscripts, or perhaps she's interested in the bibliography. Access not just to the whole, but to its parts ensures the widest potential for use of any archive. And this ties into the second idea I would like to present, in that virtuality. Now, I was going to use the word borrowed, but really it is stolen. I have stolen this term from Professor Aniket Javre's lecture titled The Humanities and Technicity in Times of Technologies. And I quote, that this is what he says about this idea of virtuality. The memory of having inscribed an object for a more or less specific purpose becomes the repeatable memory of the past of our experience, and the inscription of anticipated uses of it becomes our predictable future. With precision adding to it, this predictability gives a fixity to that thing as a tool. But the discoverable unfixed use of a tool, or even some mere thing, is an as yet unanticipated and an unremembered but constantly there property or attribute of the material and shape of the tool. This is, I'm quoting him here. This is what Aniket would call the virtuality of a thing. Let me give you an example. A coin may be used as currency, right? But it may also be tossed as a gamble. And if you were short of a screwdriver, you may use the coin to turn the screw and ensure the shelf doesn't fall on your head. That is the virtuality of the coin, the unfixed potential of use. Complex objects are necessarily less virtual. Modularity ensures that unfixed potential of use that anticipates the longevity of the archive. And to conclude, archive, even the slightest of them, have constantly to bear in mind the desire of future users. What one does know is justified only in the image of that shadowy and unimaginable figure of the future. How can one speak of the desire of that user? The digital surrogate exists then in what we might feel a radical state of alienation, its lack of tactility, its dissociation from material presence. It is probably true that a similar sense of estrangement is experienced at other critical moments of technological change, printed word, for instance, or recorded sound. But every stage, the problem of cognition is posed anew. Cognition determines access. Whatever one can say about it now is the state of the curator's knowledge here and now. One can only strive to push towards that horizon of uncertainty, where it will collide with the interrogation of the future. What questions will the future user put to the digital repository? What form will her interest take? Survival of the archive, the digital archive, then relies on the quality of curation, the kind of access you provide, the modularity of the system, how observable and accessible the parts are, and the unfixed uses of the holdings of the archive. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinayak.